So, the Twitter president strikes again. There's quite a few things I want to cover in this video, so bear with me. Donald Trump has attacked the NHS, right? It's not the first time an American politician has done this, and it's certainly not surprising in the case of Trump. This is a president who seems to conduct his entire his entire White House policy through Twitter. And just weeks after patching things up with Theresa May and praising us, saying that she was doing wonderful and we're a great country and so on, he falls back on this, creating a diplomatic rift. This is a man whose narcissism and his utter lack of diplomacy, at least on his Twitter account, is damaging alliances. And if you're a Trump supporter and don't care about that, well, I don't know what to say. But let's put that aside for now. Trump's character and his Twitter and all the rest of it. Those issues are already well covered. What I want to talk about is his attitude to the NHS, um, because there's a lot of things behind that attitude, and it isn't just Donald Trump. It's the American Republican establishment that they're just plain wrong. It's not a case of having a difference of opinion. The facts that they are suggesting to be the case are not the case. And there's a lot of scaremongering and a lot of inaccuracies being said about our health system. So, specifically, Trump used a large demonstration in London a few days ago about the situation in the NHS, and he distorted that to say that our system was in crisis and it was a issue of the system itself. Now, Jeremy Hunt, who is an albeit controversial health secretary, retweeted or tweeted in response. I may disagree with claims made on that march, but not one, in bold capitals, not one of them wants to live in a system where 28 million people have no cover. And this is the headline of the Mirror, the Metro, which is a trade daily newspaper. You know, this is something that at first bemused a lot of Britons when the whole healthcare debate was rearing up in the States, and it's a real political football in America. And there's been a few little sort of periods where this has come up during the 2008 presidential campaign, um, again a few years ago, and once again it's rising up. And I suppose the NHS is brought up because it's a well-known healthcare system, and the American right think they can capitalize on it by bringing up grievances about the way the situation is to somehow say that it's a bad healthcare system. But the point is, the grievances that are out there are not about the system itself. It's about government policy on the system, right? And there is a fundamental difference. It's not about the nature of the system itself. It's not about the principle of the system. It's about differences of opinion and how the system should be run. That's a very important difference. Um, so Jeremy Hunt was right about that. And this is an interesting situation. This is a rare situation which actually unites left and right in this country, because you will find most conservatives agree with most of the Labour colleagues that what the American Republicans are saying about our healthcare system is not only insulting, it is just plain wrong. The vast majority of Britons do not want a US style healthcare system, and there's a very good reason for that. Why? Because we get the impression that the American healthcare system is based entirely on money, is based on your means to afford healthcare. And I saw someone make this point the other day. I can't remember who it was. They may have even been American, because a lot of Americans, frankly, envy our system, or at least want to see something similar replicated. And to be fair to the Democrats, this is something, in my opinion, they are morally and practically right on. And they've been pushing it ever since FDR. But because of the Republicans voting it down time and time again, it's never quite passed to the extent that it should have. Obama went about as far as any president has tried. And what Obama was proposing wasn't perfect. It wasn't um, ideal, but I believe the principle was probably right. I would say that when you have a drastic change in any political system, of course there's going to be some people that are not happy. Of course there are going to be imperfections. I've no doubt that when Obama was pushing for um, Obamacare, there were some people that weren't happy about it. There were some people that saw it as a threat because it was challenging what was working for them. That's understandable. I concede that. But the principle that Obama was pushing for, in my opinion, was far more sound than the callous system that Trump wants. And I do believe it is callous because it is based on financial means. This idea that, and I'll quote a case actually the Metro has raised because I think this is a good example of what is rotten about the American healthcare system. And if I sound quite irritated, this is something that does anger a lot of Britons because frequently we hear this system being distorted. I mean, a few years back, I can't remember who it was, but one Republican said if um, if Stephen Hawking had the treatment of the NHS, he would be dead by now. Failing to recognise the fact that Stephen Hawking is a British citizen who, for much of his life, has been treated by the NHS and who has actually lived a lot longer than doctors initially thought. So that was one example that our American critics got dead wrong. So yeah, this is a tragic case. Man from New York, Donald Savastano, who just won the lottery. Apparently, he was told weeks ago, shortly after winning the lottery, that he had stage four cancer, and he's passed away. He's died. He won $1 million in the lottery, but he had not went to a doctor. He had not went to a doctor um, because he'd been feeling unwell. He could not afford to visit the doctor because he did not have health insurance. He could not afford the health insurance, so he did not visit the doctor. He put that off. What we always hear in this country is if you think that you have cancer, if you think you have the stages of cancer, if you think you have the symptoms, visit the doctor immediately. And in Britain, it's never a case of people being put off because they can't afford it. Why? Because um, in this country, we see it as a public service. We see it as a basic human right. There's this bizarre American attitude when it comes to universal healthcare, even though it's used in many developed countries around the world, or at least some sort of system that is close to universal healthcare. There's this attitude in the US, oh, it's socialism, it's big government, it's taking your tax dollars to give to the lazy poor people. That seems to be the prevailing attitude in the States. And it's utterly remarkable because if you're being mugged, you see the police service as a necessary force, at least most people do, right? If your house is on fire, you see the fire brigade, the fire service, as a necessary public service. So why is healthcare any different? I hate the idea that seems to be the situation in the States that if you're in an emergency, okay, they'll treat you, but then you're immediately worrying about what happens afterwards. How do I pay for this if you don't have coverage? So the fact is, there are millions of Americans probably suffering in silence because they cannot afford the insurance on basic health care. That is morally wrong. And America likes to boast about being the greatest country in the world. It's certainly the most powerful country in the world. I personally think it's a disgrace that the most powerful country in the world cannot provide such a basic need for 28 million of its own citizens. So America has no right to lecture any country when it comes to healthcare. Now, about the NHS, and this is very important. In Britain, most people don't think that the NHS is perfect. That's not the issue. We don't have blinkers on. There are problems. And yes, we also hear of certain terrible stories. For example, elderly people being left to die in ambulances because of waiting lists and so on. There are some terrible things that have happened. I'm not going to lie about that. So the NHS, as it is in at the moment, is not perfect. There has been a lot of anger from junior doctors, and there's been quite a bitter dispute with the government over that. We have heard cases of long waiting lists and so on and so on. But the issues that people are angry about within the NHS are never about the NHS itself, or at least very rarely. Like I say, most Britons agree on this, whether left wing or right wing, conservative, liberal, or socialist. Most people agree on this, and it's one of the rare issues that you will see people crossing the political divide to agree on. And that's because they recognise that it's the most utilitarian system. When the NHS was set up in 1948, it was considered to be one of the major achievements of the 20th century, in fact. That's why in the London 2012 Olympics, it was actually used as a feature of our Olympic presentation because it is an institution in this country. Most British people are proud of it. My mother worked as an NHS doctor as an NHS nurse for 40 years. Um, no one will say that the NHS is perfect, but that is not because of the principle of the system, free healthcare on the point of delivery. That's not the issue. The issue is differences in government policy and how the NHS is run. Okay? The issue is not about the principle of the NHS as a system. And that's what our American critics don't seem to understand. They say, oh, the British who are protesting hate the NHS. Well, they're just wrong about that. If you look at the placards, they were saying, save our NHS. They weren't saying get rid of the NHS. They were saying save the NHS. That is a fundamental difference. So I don't understand the American attitude to this. I shouldn't say American because there's many Americans who do understand this, and they do understand that it is about making the most utilitarian situation. They understand the Americans who can see beyond their borders. They understand that this is not about socialism; it's about a basic public service, right? And that's why it's used in many democratic countries. That's why it's being you know, no British Conservative government would dare dismantle the NHS because they know it would be totally. They might, you know, try to introduce a higher degree of privatization and so on, but they would never touch that because they know that it would be massively unpopular. Not only would it be unpopular, it would be just a bad policy. Yes, I get that Nigel Farage is over there bad mouthing our system, but quite honestly, Nigel Farage represents a political party that is now meaningless. Nigel Farage, as far as I'm concerned, is the Nigel Farage show. I wish he would stay in the States, quite frankly. A lot of people in this country are getting a little bit tired of Mr. Farage. He's an eccentric character, he's an influential character, but he's also the former leader of a party that really is just about him, and it's become a bit of a joke, actually. And for Farage to talk about patriotism whilst going to another country and bad mouthing something he knows full well is cherished by many British people is a disgrace. He's entitled to his opinion, okay, but a lot of British people are hoping he will stay there, quite honestly, or join the Trump cabinet. Seems to be what he is eyeing up to do, since he spends so much time groveling to it. Um, Personally, in my own life, I've been quite lucky. I have never had any major surgery, so I can't say I've had direct personal experience of our healthcare system. I have had some experience, and my experience has overwhelmingly been quite good. I've never had a real nightmare experience. I appreciate some people have. You know, if you have had a loved one who has died at the back of an ambulance, you're probably not going to be in a rush to praise the NHS. But like I say, where there is grievances, where there is anger, overwhelmingly it's not about the system. And people say things like, oh, well, I got a lousy doctor or a lousy nurse. That's why universal healthcare is bad. Because they argue in a privatized healthcare system, you could get, you know, a much better doctor or nurse who will give you your money's worth. But that's just the point. It all comes down to money. So I've no doubt that rich Americans have a wonderful experience because they can afford it. That's the point. It comes down to an issue of money, and I think that's grotesque. So you can say our healthcare system is socialist, but quite frankly, I'd rather people see it as a socialist system, which is misleading. It's not. It's something that is within a democratic system. It's something that is supported by British conservatives. But anyway, that to me is a lesser issue. they're in a situation where we would copy the American system in which 28 million people cannot afford basic healthcare. So they're suffering in silence. They're suffering with serious contagious diseases. They're suffering with severe pain in some cases. It's just wrong. So definitely, by the way, a lot of Americans who have traveled outside the States, almost unanimously, I have seen them say that whichever country they have been to, not just the UK, other European countries, Asian countries, you almost unanimously they have said their experience was better outside the States. So America, you have a lot of catching up to do in this regard. You're a great country. I love you in many ways. But when it comes to healthcare, you lag well behind many other countries. So you've no right, President Trump, you've no right to point fingers at our system, to distort our system, and distort the situation. Summed up, no, the NHS is not perfect, but there is a reason why an Iron Bevan, the minister under the Attlee government who introduced this in the 1940s, and there were others, but he is seen as a real driving force behind it. He was named the greatest Welshman in history, and he's one of the most respected British politicians, statesmen of the 20th century, with good cause, because he literally probably has saved millions of lives by creating a healthcare system where people did not have to worry about money in emergencies. Yes, there's some things that you pay for, but not in emergencies, not in a life, you know, money is never the issue. Waiting list, yes. Occasionally bad service, yes. But generally speaking, I will say that the vast majority of doctors and nurses are highly professional, skilled people who do this because they want to do this, not for profit. That's the point. My mother always said that her job was never about profit. It was about doing it because you want to help people's lives. You know, that's the emphasis of our healthcare system. And I'm not going to badmouth American doctors and nurses. I'm sure they're good people. I'm sure, I'm not going to do that. But yeah, Trump is wrong about this. And if he is serious about keeping up good relations with the UK, then they should apologise for once again distorting the situation, just as they did with those Britain First posts.